Yes. Hello. First of all, thank you all for coming out today. My name is Claire, and I'm going to work with you guys on a project today. The project is going to be a quilt project, a community quilt project. Let me give you a little bit of a backstory about what we are doing this project for. So, the city of Portsmouth was allotted us the 14th Street Community Center, granted us a small amount of money to do a community art project on the side of the building out here on this facility. And I wanted you guys, this youth group, to be a part of this project. So, in order to do that, I wanted to give you a little backstory on the history of quilts, quilt shapes, symbolism, and we can talk about community too. So, we probably are most familiar with quilt symbols within the Underground Railroad quilt. Did you guys learn about them in school? No? Okay. So, we know what the Underground Railroad is, right? Yeah. So, the Underground Railroad quilts were a way that the slaves trying to get to freedom would communicate to one another, and the abolitionists and those that were helping them along the Underground Railroad would communicate the different stops and the ways that they would get to where they were wanting to go. And a lot of the quilts that we see today still may still have these symbols in them. So like the log cabin quilt, which I've got one up here, which is one that my great-grandmother actually made, is one that I see a lot. And the North Star one is also one that I see a lot pretty frequently. This is an actual representation of a Underground Railroad quilt sampler. So this wouldn't have been what was actually represented. You wouldn't have seen this particular quilt on the Underground Railroad, but this has been created in contemporary times to represent these quilt patterns that would have been used in historic of the Underground Railroad. So you've got like the Drunkard's Path, the North Star, and the Monkey Wrench, and these would have been huge quilts that would have been hung on banisters, up on the barns. They would have been very large and able to be seen from a pretty good distance. That way people were able to communicate. This is one way that people, if you weren't slaves, if they weren't able to read and write, this was a symbol, a way of communication that was symbol-based. And so people could communicate with one another, but people who they didn't want to know what was going on, people who were against the abolitionists, they didn't understand what the symbols were. These are symbols found in Hawaiian quilts. And so quilts span from culture to culture. They're not just represented in our continental U.S., but they're also, you can find these beautiful quilt patterns in the Hawaiian culture as well. This is a wonderful representation of symmetry. You guys know, you know what symmetry is. So what are the different types of symmetry that we have? Do you know what the terms are for them? So symmetrical, yes. So we've got radial symmetry. So radial symmetry would be like this, where symmetry comes from all different directions. All of these are radial symmetry. Bilateral symmetry, like in this, you can see that it's almost radial. You almost have symmetry going in the 4 different directions. But because this turtle is asymmetrical, which means it's symmetrical it's not completely symmetrical, this is created bilateral symmetry. Bi meaning 2, so it's got symmetry on 2 sides. So if you drew a line straight down this quilt, straight down this design, you would be able to mirror this. It's sometimes called mirror symmetry as well. So you see a lot of quilt patterns, like if we go back to this, these have radial symmetry. This Drunkard's Path has some beautiful radial symmetry. It also has some really nice organic shapes in it. technically geometric because if you think of quilts, they're cut out of cloth and you have to sew them together either with a sewing machine or by hand, and that's hard to do if there's a lot of curves in them. And so a lot of people stick with straight lines that create really geometric shapes. This one has some nice curves in it, but it's still a geometric shape. And then we live in Appalachia. This is the region that we live in. Scioto County is technically a county in Appalachia, in the Appalachian foothills. We've got a lot of Appalachian quilts. The one that I brought in is technically an Appalachian quilt. It was made here in this area. This one would also be an Appalachian quilt. It's a double wedding band quilt. It's got a lot of geometric shapes. It's got symmetry, and it's got a lot of really interesting patterns and textures in it. And then if you look at this one, which is usually a lot of times on our TV, Miss Maxine let me borrow this one. This one is representative of some of those nice patterns that we saw earlier, those really simple geometric, those quilt patterns. But quilts can also have shapes in them. They can also be really intricate, like this one that was this is completely hand embroidered, but it's got more representational images in it, with flowers and butterflies. Each of these stand alone. They don't have the intricacies the way that some of these other quilts have. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the symbolism within individual quilt tiles. So sometimes quilts can be really representational, like the butterfly quilt. Like this one is tulips. Pretty obvious that it's tulips, right? This one is called a tulip basket, so it looks like a basket full of flowers. These two are both, this one's called the rugged cross and my grandmother's cross, and so you can see that those are faith-based. Those are representational of the cross and Christianity. And this one is just a nice, beautiful, organic or geometric pattern that's got a lot of negative space and positive space as well as the texture within that quilt. And then this one, which is a more contemporary quilt, I found this one online. This one has representational images of people, of African women. They've got hats on, they've got their dresses on, and then you can see this nice texture and this nice quilting within the actual dresses, as well as them representing the house. And so this could represent family, this could represent community itself because it's got a lot of people surrounding one house. But the way that people use quilts and the way that people design quilts is so expansive. You know, there are so many different types of quilts. And a lot of them use symbols. So we all know what symbols are. We're used to symbols. We use symbols a lot in our day-to-day lives. Like emojis are symbols, right? We use those constantly. Like, what are some symbols that we see every day?
Handicap signs.
Handicap signs, yeah. Street signs, for sure.
Deer crossings.
Yeah.
Street.
Yeah, for sure. Other types of signs.
No smoking.
No smoking signs. Yeah, we see, and they're ways of communicating, right? All of these symbols are different ways that we communicate with one another. That way we don't have to visually read what is being expressed. We don't have to read a bunch of words. We can just see a picture of something and say, oh, that's what that means. You see a big blue H on the side of the road, you know that's the hospital. A hospital's nearby, right? That's a symbol that we use. What other types of symbols do we use a lot? Like,
No carrying guns like in schools.
Yeah, no carrying guns. What about the brands that we see every day? Do they use symbols in their logos?
Nike.
Yeah. Oh all kinds of brands, like all kinds of logos, and that communicates. We're able to get a vibe of what that brand is based on those symbols. But community, I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about community. We are a community center. We function out of a community center. What symbols can you guys think of, and what ways can we express community? What types of things can we use to express community? Does anything come off the top of your head? I included the definition just so we could talk about it. A group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common is one definition. And a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. And so, could we represent community by symbolizing a group of people? How might that look if we were to create our own symbols?
Like 3 people in a sign in a circle.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So people itself, like actually representational figures. What else? What kind of shapes could we use? A heart? Yeah, absolutely. For sure. That would symbolize what specifically? Love, which is a feeling that we have as a community for one another, right? What else? What are some reasons that communities are built together? What brings people together to form a community?
To make the place better.
To make a place better. How could we symbolize making somewhere better? Well, it's kind of tricky, isn't it?
Friendship.
Friendship. How could you symbolize friendship? How do you... Okay, so what visual images could you use to symbolize friendship? Someone hugging. Yes, that would be cool. That would be nice. That's a nice symbol. What else? What other feelings or emotions or ways can we symbolize community and the feelings that surround community?
High five.
High five, absolutely. Lorenzo, Amari, what are you thinking?
Pictures of people smiling.
Smiles, yeah. Friendship, friendliness.
Holding hands.
Love it.
A pat on the back.
A pat on the back. Peace. How do you symbolize peace? Come on, Lorenzo. How can we symbolize peace? A peace sign. We already have a symbol for peace. Exactly. So we've got all of these ways to symbolize community, right? If we think about these complex and not so complex emotions and feelings that go into community, why we are all together, right? We all gravitate to the community center for one reason or another. And I think that if we think about it, we can figure out that reason personally. And as we go through this project, yes, TJ?
Helping others.
Helping others. Aw, is that why you come to the community center? Oh. So, I think that as we continue this project, as you guys start working on your particular quilt tile, think about that. Think about what your personal tie to this community center is. Not just, oh, this is what community represents. That will make a good quilt tile, don't get me wrong. But you guys gravitate to the center for a reason. Show me why. Express that in some sort of way. Use a symbol. Create a symbol and express that. I did want to show this example of a more contemporary artist who makes these really contemporary quilts. And that gives me a chance to talk about some of these different aspects of art. We talked about symmetry. Does this piece have any symmetry? Maybe a little bit here and there. Certain aspects of it have symmetry. But for the most part, this is asymmetrical. Some quilts are asymmetrical. This quilt has a lot of shapes, right? A lot of shapes. It has a lot of contrast, which is what I wanted to talk specifically about to you guys. When I go through digitizing and taking this project to the next step, I'm going to photograph these quilt tiles that you make, and they are going to not necessarily stay the color that they are when you create them. They're going to change just slightly, which means that you need to be really cognizant. You need to recognize what colors you're putting next to one another. We want to make sure that when you create an image, that you also create space around that image. We've got positive and negative space. Positive space is the shape that you create, right? So, like in my case, I created a really basic flower, like it's a lily. And so this positive space is actually white. The negative space, the space around it, all this space that it kind of floats inside of, that's going to be your negative space. And so you've got to make sure to distinguish between your positive and your negative space. So you're going to need to have that contrast between colors and tones. So as you continue through this project, think about the symbol that you want to create, but also think about as you express that, as we create this project, make sure it's got a pretty good amount of contrast. This one my friend had done. She made sure to have a good amount of contrast. Her foreground, her positive space is black, and her negative space is white. That's a pretty traditional way of representing space. So think about that as you come up with your image. This one has a little bit less contrast, right? Still is contrasting. This dark blue is in contrast to this light blue, but these two colors don't contrast as much. If I have to change the colors into black and white, these two are going to kind of fade into one another. So if it's a detail on your image that you don't want it to get lost, make sure that it's still a contrasting color. If it's just a texture and more of a decorative thing, like I've got these that sort of float around the outside to mimic some of the designs in quilts that happen regularly, it's not as big of a deal. But your image, make sure it's got contrast between the background. I forgot to ask, do you guys have quilts at home? No? You lost it?
Your mom or grandma might have some.
Yeah, my grandma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you? Your dad? Mm-hmm.
None?
None? You ain't got grandma quilt? None of hers? I know Grandma Parker has a whole bunch of quilts.
She might, I don't know.
I love quilts. I
Yeah,
sit with a
do you?
quilt.
No, my grandma does.
Your grandma has it.
Ask about quilts. If your grandparents have quilts and it looks old, or maybe it looks new, because quilts have a way of lasting for a long time and retaining their integrity. Ask about them. See if they've got a story behind them, because a lot of times quilts are passed down between generations. Like my great grandma made that quilt. She worked at Martin's. She was in the upholstery department, which means that she was one of the people who helped upholster, which means that she puts fabric on furniture, and she sewed a lot of drapes, and so she would take home the scraps of upholstery and the scraps of drapes, and she would sew them together. And I brought this one. It's tattered and torn. It's been at Albuquerque and back with me. But I brought it because you're able to see the way that quilts are put together. I pulled the back off of it accidentally. But quilts, they end up, the first thing that they do is they stitch one of the tiles together. And so, like this square right here would have been stitched together. I think she did most of her stitching by hand, and then it would then be laid into the rest of the tiles. She would stitch all of these tiles together and then put a backing on it. There's usually a couple layers but it makes you feel like snuggly, you know. They're really comfortable. So which is why I wanted to do a quilt-based project with you guys. So the way that we're going to go about doing this is, once you think of your symbol, probably more simple, doesn't have to be super complex, but I do want it to be something that is personal. I've created a grid for each of you, and that's what I made mine on. I used a grid for mine, that way it stayed nice and even. It's Leah. And I've got all of these wallpaper tiles, and so they're cut in 2-inch squares. They're ready to be glued on. Some of them are already cut into diagonals. You can use diagonals. I cut a bunch of mine into diagonals. You can cut them in half. You can cut them in quarters. You don't have to cut them at all. You can cut them in circles if you want to. Whatever design you want, you're more than welcome to cut the squares however you see fit. This is your tile. This is your quilt square. So you stitch it together the way that you see it needs to be stitched together. I do recommend laying everything out before you start gluing, for sure. I laid all of mine out, and then I started gluing mine, and I'm glad I did, because there are a couple that I needed to move around a little bit as I kind of laid everything out. So, lay it out, then start gluing. I worked from the outside in when I started gluing, but you can work from the top down, you can work from the inside out, whatever works for you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Once you put those on that grid, what's going to happen for the building?
So, from this point, these are going to be our originals. From this point, I'm going to photograph this with a high quality camera, very large scale, and then I'm going to drop this into my photo editing software, and I'm going to probably, more than likely, turn this into a 2 to 3 color quilt tile. It's probably going to be what's called a limited color palette. That way I can keep the colors very similar to one another. These are pretty muted colors, so I'm going to more than likely up the vibrancy of that, meaning I'm going to make them pop. I'm going to make the colors more bright. And then I'm going to digitally stitch each of these quilt tiles together in my photo editing software. And then they're going to be printed out and installed onto a board, which will then be installed onto the side of the building. So, yeah. So, it'll be...
It's really nice, guys. Gonna be up there for a long time.
It will be. Yes.
That's my ideas for the vacation.
Can you what?
That's my ideas for the vacation.
Yeah, what's your idea?
I want to do the fish for Black Lives
I
Matter.
literally
I
just
love
said
it.
that. What do you get in my brain?
Okay, great. I like to take mine with me
Yeah.
for the weekend. I'm a little tired. It's not mine. I don't have to do it now, but I like to take mine and work on it for the weekend.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good presentation.
Thank you. Thank you guys. Thank you all
Thank you, guys.
so much. And I will pass out the
If they
glue
don't get
sticks.
finished tonight, will they be able to come back?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we definitely need that, guys. And 1, 2, 3. Don't do the chair like that sign. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Every time they come, add to their thing for me, please.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
for
you guys.
making that.
So the glue sticks are, I gave everyone, there's glue sticks for each of you at the table. Don't share glue sticks, coronavirus. Try to, you can come in. Yeah, you're good, Mary. Come on.
You got 80.
Oh, sorry. You can go, oh no, you're fine. We'll pick back up.
See you guys later. I'm sorry about
I'm gonna, I can just read it. Yeah, I can.
I don't have IQ. I just have the IQ. How would I make this work?
Claire, that
Oh,
was my
TJ,
whole
but you
idea.
still
I was
fine.
gonna do
I was gonna do a fish.
No, I'm doing a bird, so nobody said that.
Okay, what's a bird?
Hey, will you hit the end film?
Yeah.